Good morning, everyone. How are folks doing? Please be sure to utilize our Q&A and chat features if you have any things you'd like to drop. I'm going to kick this off by introducing myself. So my name is Anjali Patel. I'm the executive director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business, and I'm very excited to have this conversation today on the state of DEI and ESG reporting in 2025. Before we get started, I will go ahead and share with you a couple of logistical announcements. First, our team will drop in the chat a link for you to sign up for MCLE. Be sure to fill that out during the portion of this webinar so you can get credit for that. Second, the Berkeley Center for Law and Business is very proud to announce the 2025 Berkeley Forum on M&A in the Boardroom, which is on April 23rd, starting at 12:30 p.m. It will be streamed live, and you are able to sign up to watch the whole thing at the link that will just be dropped in the chat shortly. So please don't forget to register, and we hope to see you there. And then finally, if you have any questions at all, please email us at bclb@law.berkeley.edu. We're here to help answer any questions you have. So I won't take up any more of your time because we have a robust conversations plan today. I'm going to hand it out over to our faculty director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business, Stavros Godinas. Please take it away.
Hello, hi everyone. Hi Anjali. Thanks very much for joining us. I'm Stavros Gadinis. I'm the faculty director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Business, and I've been teaching business law in Berkeley since 2010. I'm very excited to be joined today by Eric Girding, an old friend and former colleague of mine. And Melissa Hodgman. But why don't I let you guys introduce yourselves?
Sure, so I can kick it off. Stavros, it's always good to see you. It's always good to be in front of a Berkeley audience. It is one of the best universities in the world. And my son graduated from Berkeley in May, so go Bears. Melissa and I are both partners at Freshfields. I'm in the capital markets group, and I'll let Melissa introduce herself in a minute. But up until December, I was at the SEC, and I was the director of the Division of Corporation Finance. And Stavros and I go way back to when I was a law professor at the University of Colorado, and even before then. So, Melissa?
Hello, and I apologize. Of course, I have to have technical difficulties today. My name is Melissa Hodgman, and as Eric mentioned, he and I work together at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I was there in the Division of Enforcement for about 17 years, so I've seen a little bit of everything. But we're in new times, and so we're very interested in having a dialogue today and hoping you all will ask us questions as we go along. This would have been the fifth administration change that I saw had I stayed at the Commission. I left in December, but many thoughts and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you very much both for joining us. We're very much looking forward to hearing from you because I think that someone with your background at the agency can really help us understand how to navigate this moment. Now, the topic for today is the state of DEI disclosure. And as we all know, there has been a huge shift in the way we're thinking about DEI in later years, and particularly after the inauguration of the new administration. So I would like to kick us off by asking perhaps you, Melissa, to give us an overview of what the administration has done and where we all are in connection with the DEI. We hear a lot of things around us, but what exactly are the legal issues and what is their status?
So DEI was something that even before this administration came in, there were a number of what we call red states that were coming after people with regard to their programs or their disclosure with regard to hiring based on diversity and inclusion. When Donald Trump took the White House on January 21st, one of the first things he did was issue a series of executive orders that targeted diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly in public, but also in private sector programs, which was something that we had not seen before. And those included something called Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. That one focused on federal government. And then he also, at various times, asked for parts of the US government, and in particular the Department of Justice, to begin investigations into DEI practices, quote, in the private sector and in educational institutions that receive federal funds, unquote. And that was on February 5th of this year. And since then, there have been a number of lawsuits with regard to these actions. Some things have been stayed. Other things recently on Friday started to move forward. But at this point in time, there are a number of both public actions in the U.S. government taking down DEI programs, as well as private actions seeking to obtain information with regard to private entities, educational institutions, and others. And so that's kind of where we're starting from.
Mm-hmm. So, so that means that there are a lot of kind of legal issues and potential legal risks facing companies out there. And what I'd like to get a better sense is that on the one hand, there's a lot of uncertainty. Companies don't know whether they're going to be targeted or not and what's going to be the issue. On the other hand, we are in mid-March, over mid-March. That means we are in the beginning of the 2025 proxy season. A lot of companies are preparing their annual reports, their proxy statements, and some of them might have been filed. They're getting ready to file them with the SEC. And these annual reports and the proxy statements were documents that conventionally included a lot of disclosure around DEI. So now this kind of disclosure might exactly be an issue for the administration. On the one hand, you have investors that are still demanding for these types of disclosures. On the other hand, this might generate risk. So how can we advise companies to navigate this scenario?
So Stavros, I think you're putting your finger on a particular issue for many public companies, in that they have to think about how their annual report and proxy disclosures might be used for purposes that are not connected to federal securities laws. So given the environment that Melissa described, one of the things that public companies are thinking about is whether what they say in their annual reports or in their proxy statements could be the basis for federal government investigations, congressional inquiries, state AG inquiries, or even private lawsuits. Even if the disclosure is squarely about federal securities law, this means that federal securities lawyers are in a different and unusual position. They have to worry not just about what do the federal securities laws require and about securities law liability. They have to worry about this extra securities law issues and how securities disclosure could be used. And to answer your question, securities lawyers should go back to sort of basic securities lawyering and start with the question of what needs to be disclosed in an annual report or in a proxy statement, and break down what is in an annual report or in a proxy statement into three buckets. Bucket one, what is required by the line items of the federal securities law rules. Bucket two, what's required, but what is more principles-based disclosure. And bucket three, what is more voluntary disclosure. And by breaking disclosure into those three buckets, companies can have a better sense of what they need to say and what they want to say in their securities disclosure in order to think about their risk profile for these extra beyond securities law disclosure considerations. As you noted, Stavros, uh, most companies look at December 31st fiscal year end, have either already filed their annual reports or have them due at the end of this particular month. So the attention is really going to be focused on proxy statements, and many of them are also already either being heavily worked on or have already been filed. In terms of proxy statements, there's really one item that fits into bucket one in the proxy rules, and that's item 407. Item 407 is about what public companies have to say about their nominating committees, the nominating committees who are selecting or evaluating candidates for the board. And let me just sort of read item 407. It's the only place in the federal securities laws where diversity is explicitly called out. So in item 407, C2, clause 6, companies have to describe the nominating committee's process for identifying and evaluating nominees for director. They have to describe whether, and if so, how the nominating committee or the board considers diversity in identifying nominees for director. If the nominating committee or the board has a policy with respect to the consideration of diversity in identifying director nominees, describe how this policy is implemented, as well as how the nominating committee or the board assesses the effectiveness of its policy. So I was reading straight from the item there. That's one example of how diversity, if it is used by a nominating committee and evaluating candidates, has to be disclosed. So that's one thing that would fall into bucket one.
Yes. So let's start with those mandatory disclosures first, Eric. So for these issues, companies really don't have a choice. They have to provide disclosure. At the same time, if they're targeted in a lawsuit, maybe directly by a federal agency, maybe by state authorities, even maybe by private plaintiffs, the fact that this disclosure was mandatory, I'm not sure how much is going to matter because they have to say something about it. So the question is, given that you have to say something about it, is there any way to protect yourself from legal risk?
And let me just jump in there to say, and you're also in often a Hobbesian situation. For example, the 20F filers, the foreign filers, they are coming from jurisdictions where there is a lot of DEI process, procedure, disclosure required as well. So you may be engaged in a risk analysis to determine where you have to be based on wherever your jurisdictions are and the requirements of multiple jurisdictions. So not just the US, federal, state, blue state, red state kind of conflict, but what does Europe require? What does Canada require? And so as part of trying to figure out practically what you can do in that type of environment, particularly for these 20F filers who their filings aren't due until the end of April. And so they're deeply into thinking about this as well as US entities. We've talked a lot about where within the filing this information falls. We've called it the real estate. How early in the filing is it? How often does it appear? Because I do think you'll see a lot of running of searches using of AI to identify the programs that a lot of these entities have in place and what their disclosure is. And we haven't had a definition of what unlawful DEI is. The category of unlawful DEI is yet to be defined and something that's in the course right now. So it's not suggesting that all DEI is a problem. And you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you were taking off all of your disclosure. That suggests that something you had there before potentially was improper or inappropriate. And this administration is 4 years in length. The statute of limitations for the SEC, for example, is 5 or 10. So you could be facing, questions if you completely remove your disclosure of, was it accurate then? Is it accurate now? Are you trying to make a misstatement? So we've really talked about kind of the real estate in the filings, what terms are being used. And then this administration wants things tied to the bottom line. They're looking at things from a quantitative point of view. And so also, what is the language of your disclosure? How do you articulate why DEI is important to your bottom line? If it's retention or getting the best people to come to your firm, or is it that you would be fined in Europe if you didn't do this, and the amount of that fine would be X dollars? There are a number of ways of thinking about that, and we've actually counseled firms to talk to their own DEI personnel about how they measure the benefit to the bottom line and to disclose that.
So this is fascinating for someone that does research on corporate governance, because we are trying to figure out how these governance processes work. So I'm really excited that you're getting us into the details on the ground, Melissa. So let me kind of hone in on some of these aspects and ask you both to give us some examples of how do you tie your diversity efforts to your mission. You have to give those disclosures. One element that you mentioned is metrics, so it would be great if you could give us some examples of what these metrics might be, but also, and what other ways are available, you think, in helping companies tying DEI to specific outcomes, to financial outcomes, let me say.
So I think it's really a back to basics approach, Stavros, and thinking about basic questions. Like, how is whatever you're doing on recruitment and retention driving your overall business strategy? How is it helping a company find the best talent and keep the best talent? If your shareholders or your customers are asking for something, say that. If something is being required by another jurisdiction anywhere in the world in which you operate, and that is driving a particular policy, say that. It's not there might be examples where prior disclosure just did not articulate what was actually being driven by shareholder requests, what was being driven by customers, what was being driven by actual legal requirements in other countries. And so that kind of back to basics approach, I think, serves securities lawyers well in trying to navigate this.
Okay, that's very exciting. Now, there's so Melissa also said something else that kind of sparked interest in me, in my mind. She said, well, if you haven't, if you do exactly the opposite from what you were doing before, this will be kind of like admitting that your efforts before were not the correct ones or were problematic. So I wanted to ask you to expand
I don't
a
know
little
if
bit
it's
on
like
that.
admitting it. Like, I mean, just sort of let me, like, sorry,
Yeah,
Stavros, I'm
yes,
still
sorry.
a law professor at heart, so like,
Opening
we'll see.
yourself to
I think that's
yeah.
the concern, right? Is that it could be an argument that by changing the disclosure, there could be that could be perceived. I don't think that that's necessarily reality, though, right? And I don't think that
Okay.
changing disclosure necessarily, like, legally admits anything.
Absolutely. Yes. No, thanks for jumping in.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would also say though is I don't think being at any extremes with this administration or the
Mhm.
next administration or with Europe or blue states, red states is where anyone wants to be. And so if you're changing back and forth based on the administration, I do think you're opening yourself up to complaints from all sides, as opposed to taking a more measured, considered, risk-based analysis approach to the disclosure that you need for your particular business. And I think that if you can articulate it as the needs for your particular business and the judgment that you're making and tie that to the bottom line, which is, I think, the back to basics that Eric was describing, you put yourself kind of in the middle of the pack with everyone as opposed to being the target for any particular side.
Mhm.
And the answer, Stavros, is I think at some point, um, regardless of what happens in DC, it's just good practice every once in a while for companies to take a completely fresh look at their annual report and proxy statements, right? And figure out, okay, like why are we saying these things? Where is this required? What is this optional? Who's asking for this? And how is this sort of driving investor wealth? And I think that fresh kind of eyes on it is always a good idea, and always, I think, something that you can uh, that public companies can tell their shareholders and their
Mhm.
regulators why they're looking afresh.
That's great, Eric. So let's start there. You're deciding, okay, let me look at my DI disclosures with a fresh eye. Let me try to figure out what is my risk profile. How should companies go about it, trying to understand what kind of risk analysis they need to do around DI? Which companies are more likely to be targeted? Or less likely to be targeted. If you're a junior staffer in the administration, who do you go after?
I can start with that, Melissa, and then I'll uh, let you add thoughts. I mean, I think the first piece of analysis is the company a household name? Is it really in the public eye or not? But even if it's not a household name, even if it's not something discussed around the Thanksgiving dinner table, there might still be risk there. And one of the things that companies might consider is just a control F risk. And what I mean by that is if a staffer or if a bot were just searching an annual report or a proxy statement, how often are they going to come across certain key search terms? And that's not to say that you have a Stone Axe approach of just control X, control C, Control V, like you're just searching and replacing terms. But look at how often particular search terms are being used in a disclosure document and go over each one of those times that diversity and inclusion in particular are used and ask again the first question, like, is this required? Is it principles-based disclosure? Is it voluntary? And if it's going to stay in the document, even if it's voluntary, then you have to sort of tie it back into, is it driving business strategy? Is it something that shareholders are demanding, customers are demanding? Is it something required by another jurisdiction? Melissa?
Yeah, and I agree with all of that, Eric. The other thing that I think people have to think about is the Trump administration has asked each agency to identify nine of the entities or individuals that they regulate as, the worst offenders or those engaged in unlawful DEI practices. If you are regulated by more than one U.S. Agency or come up somehow on a list by, for example, the SEC and the FTC, if you come up more than once, I think that that could put you more at risk of these types of reviews and actions. If you are entities that have recently been in front of Congress, are pulled up by Republican members, for example, I also think that that might be something that could put you in the crosshairs because it shows that you're an area of focus. The administration in various areas around the SEC has mentioned also national security as being a driver or competition in the FCPA area. So I think all of these things that might already have you under the attention of this particular administrations or Republicans on the Hill or people at agencies, I think those are the things that might make you more likely to be pulled in.
That's great. So Eric mentioned household names a little before as more likely targets, and the Starbucks example kind of comes to mind. So I was wondering if you could give us a sense of what happened there and if there are any lessons to be drawn for other companies looking at what happened at Starbucks.
So Eric, if you want me to start.
Yeah, why don't you start?
Sure. So in Missouri, Starbucks was asked to provide information because there was disclosure that suggested that their hiring had shifted, and that there was hiring based on what the state of Missouri considers unlawful DEI. If there were targets, for example, that's one thing that they look at. If there were goals, if the hiring seemed to have shifted from one demographic to another. And I think those are the things that the state is looking at changing behavior. We've seen something similar from Texas with regard to other companies and litigations that have been begun based on the still undefined unlawful discrimination. But I think those targets, shifts in demographics, statistical things are being used in order to kind of identify who might be considered for review and evaluation.
Well, let me add a little bit of color there, Stavros. So companies may find that some of the kinds of litigation that could be brought have no merit. But it's still a cost for the company in terms of not only dollars spent, but also personnel and executive time spent on a litigation to go ahead and defend a matter or to respond to a particular regulatory inquiry. So it's not just the merits of a particular case that matter, it's the total headache or the total amount of time and money that's being spent on inquiries. And there's also the reputational consideration. Reputational considerations can cut all sorts of different ways here, but this is not just sort of standard litigation analysis here.
Mm. So this is how things are looking from the outside. One of the questions that I think is on many people's minds is what happens in corporations on the inside. Now, what you disclose is one thing, but also how you change your approach and how you change your policy and how you change the way you communicate is a different question. So in terms of internal guidance, what are you recommending to your clients? What should companies be mindful of or aware of in this new environment?
So Eric, do you want to start or would you like me to?
Well, why don't you start? But I'll save a little bit of powder.
So I think something that we've talked to people about are what their values are and how those values are expressed. And when we're talking about retention and things that go to the bottom line and things that the particular customer base may be interested in, I think the dialogues are very similar. And so one of the things that we've talked about is that whole review it can be a risk-based review with regard to your DEI programs and your DEI disclosure. So it's the programs as well as the disclosure. And within that, you might be looking at, do you have groups that are in some way exclusive as opposed to welcoming everybody? For example, a member of a women's club, everyone is welcome. Is everybody invited? Is everybody intended to be there? You might be looking at, are there groups that you don't have particular focus groups for? Are there people who may have been left out? Oh, do you have a question, Stavros?
Just on this topic, because I find it very interesting. When you say a women's group, but everybody is welcome, do you mean women and men? Is that something that we need to think about?
Yes, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or if you have with just St. Patrick's Day, if you have an Irish American group, do you have to be Irish American to come?
Mm-hmm.
And then are you missing a Lebanese group? Are you missing? You can expand as opposed to contract as one way to
Mm-hmm.
be responsive to make sure that everybody's being considered and everybody's feeling welcomed and that their needs are in place. And so
Mm-hmm.
thinking about it from the point of view of growing the pie. I think is one of those things that we've discussed as a practical approach.
Mm-hmm.
This is a really tough subject, Stavros. Like, let me just sort of acknowledge that for everybody in the audience, right? Because on the one hand, there is legal risk here for companies, and there's even like basic considerations about like what communications are discoverable and subpoenaable. But at the same time, managers and people working at public companies need to continue to do business. They need to continue to have an engaged, effective workforce. They need to continue to hire and recruit and retain people. And they need to have like to bring a sense of energy to their job every day. So I think managing how to be careful and precise about what is um, communicated on about a company's values and what is communicated about a company's workforce, but not have a chilling effect that means you're just not uh, a high energy place to work is really critical.
Now, so on this point, you bring up something that the efforts that companies make to kind of cultivate or maintain a certain type of environment in their workforce. What you see on the news is that companies take various positions on this question in practice. So there are some companies that are scrapping DI programs and initiatives, and these make the headlines. And there are other companies that are defending DI initiatives, and they go out very publicly saying that they do so. And we have had examples of both of them in the news. So I was wondering, in your practice, where do most companies lie along this continuum, and what kind of issues you see as they approach you?
I think we're seeing companies publicly take a very broad, very diverse set of
Mm,
approaches here to this particular kind of environment. And it really goes, I think, to uh, whether a company thinks that its DEI initiatives are driving shareholder value or not.
mm,
And companies can have differing approaches to that. The key thing here, though, is think about basics when you're back to basics when you're talking about securities law, because the question here that like I focus on in my practice is what has to be in your securities filings,
mhm,
what ought to be disclosed, um, and what's voluntary. And if you are making a choice about DEI initiatives, you obviously have to be materially, there can't be material misstatements or omissions in your securities law filings. But there's a separate question about like what has to be disclosed, and if it's voluntary, do you put it in your filings or not? So there's sort of like more core business questions about what to do about DEI, and then there's a separate and related set of questions about what you put in your annual report and your proxy statement.
So another issue that came up in our conversation earlier, and I wanted to return to, is the impact of AI on disclosures and DI statements. And you said that this is a big tool that people are going to be utilizing in order to identify areas of concern. So what should companies be aware of? And what are some of the strategies in order to kind of deal with this type of intense, data surveying efforts? Melissa, maybe as a former investigator, I want to turn this to you, or as a former enforcer, let me say, I would like to turn this to you.
I identify as an investigator. I'm very, very happy
Perfect.
to have that term used. What I would say is it's a lot of the things that we've been talking about is practical advice. You need to go through your risk-based analysis and figure out who you are, where you're located. Do you have requirements to have disclosure? Are you in Europe and happen to trade ADRs, and the SEC will be looking at you because of that? Or are you in New York and you're traded on the New York Stock Exchange? So I think there's some very practical things that come into play that way, as well as, are you one of the people who's been identified on the list of 9 by any of the particular agencies, as Trump has requested? And then you're looking again at your real estate. I run searches in the Edgar system, which is where the SEC keeps all of the filings, and it was Eric's domain, so he may have thoughts on this as well. And you can see there are some firms that disclose DEI very early on in their filings, page 8. Page 2, and then there are others who are disclosing it for the first time back on page 57. There are those that talk about it in 25, 57, 30 different places, and there's some that just talk about it in one place. And then there are some that use the term DEI, and others talk about building shareholder value through, and they might pick a different word than diversity. They might, being responsive to the needs of the communities who, are our customers most often. It's all about being in a risk-based posture, thinking about where you sit, and doing that back to basics analysis that Eric mentioned to make sure that your disclosure, when searched, doesn't fall into the unlawful category.
Yes, sorry, Stavros. I don't think that there's it takes a very high-tech approach to do the kind of analysis or the kind of like what a junior staffer would do here. My Berkeley graduate could probably code a way uh, to pretty quickly do like very sophisticated red lines of lots of public company disclosure to show what's the difference between this year versus last year and how often key search terms show up, and do a
That
heat
doesn't
map
make
of.
me feel better, Eric, but go on.
Well, I mean, my tuition money went to Berkeley, so
Yeah.
like he knows what he's doing back there and at home. So um, I don't know that it's the most sophisticated AI that is going to be used to sort of figure out which companies have the most risk and the most risk exposure here. I do think that companies are going to be um, in a little bit of cross currents here, right? Because were we to have had this kind of webinar last year at this time, the big topic was how is AI potentially having disparate impact in hiring? And this year, is AI being used to search for filings or potential quote unquote illegal DEI?
And you
Um,
mean disparate impact in the opposite direction, right?
right.
Yeah.
Right. So, like this time last year, one of the big hot topics in the academy was are companies using AI as part of their HR processes, and is that leading to uh, discriminatory hiring because the inputs into the hiring decision could theoretically yield discriminatory hiring. So you're like a lot of companies are going to be facing cross currents because there are still municipalities and states that are very much focused on that original question and are going to be very focused on looking at discrimination and hiring practices in a more traditional sense. And then you're going to see more red states have a very diametrically opposed litigation strategy. So companies are in a difficult position in this particular environment.
Great. So at the very beginning of our conversation, Eric, you mentioned that boards have been, and nomination for boards has traditionally been one of the areas where there's um, uh, uh, disclosure about the process of nomination. So I wanted to ask you to talk about boards more broadly. There's some of the issues that we've been dealing with is about the relationship of the company with consumers, clients, kind of more day-to-day business. But if I'm sitting on the board and I'm looking at this, at what's happening, and I'm trying to think about the strategy of the company in relation to DEI 2, 3, 5 years down the line. What are some practical issues that I need to have in mind based on what's happening right now?
Well, I think like you start with sort of who's on the board, right? And
Hmm.
it's a traditional consideration to think about board composition, right? To have a mixture of different perspectives and backgrounds on the board, and to balance having different perspectives with having board members who are able to express differences, but at the end of the day, come to a consensus on how the direction of the company ought to move. And it's um, before the term DEI was even used. It's a traditional consideration, right? To make sure that your board has those different perspectives, that your board is able to give you insights into the different markets that you operate. So that's not something new or invented within the last 10 years. Those are traditional considerations for board composition. And what's true for board composition, I think is true for the overall direction of a company. So when I talk about back to basics for securities disclosure, I think that applies to corporate governance too. Um, Figuring out how your company is going to gain market share in all of the markets it operates, how it's going to connect with its customers and its consumers around the world in whatever markets it operates, is a core business goal. Figuring out how you recruit and retain a workforce that helps you grow your business in all of the markets that you operate is a core business goal. And that's not something that's changed, regardless of, political debates on particular initials.
So this is fascinating to me, and I'm going to identify two elements, and then I'm going to turn to a question to Melissa, which is this idea that if you're that companies very often run into social controversies. Innovative companies come up with innovative products that end up disrupting many groups in society. So they end up against social controversies and kind of the conventional account, which is the better prepared you are, the more data you have, the more thoughtful and careful your analysis has been, and the more you're able to document all that, can help you address, mitigate legal risk, regardless of whether this legal risk is coming from the left, from the right, or from whichever possible direction. And that's a little bit of what we're saying here. And I'm very excited because I'm writing on this topic. So thanks for pointing it out. But
Stavros, like everything is all about your writing. That's what we know. Yes.
Yes. But there's another question that I had in mind for Melissa, which is a question that comes from some of our audience. People are wondering, yes, it seems like companies are in this catch-22 situation, which we're just identifying, and they're expecting, possible attacks from all directions. Now, we don't know exactly what illegal DEI means, and Melissa, you alluded to that already, that we don't know the meaning. But tell us a little bit about what we know so far about this question, and what are the issues that remain open, or how do you think this debate will play out in your mind? And I'm clearly, asking you to predict here, so I'm mindful of that.
Yes, and I'll do my best, but I think this ties into what Eric was just saying. Companies understanding their business model, that's something the SEC has always focused on. The SEC is not supposed to be a prescriptive agency, and that's true of many agencies in the United States. It's supposed to leave business judgments and business decisions to businesses. And so knowing your business, the board being able to, I think it's a matter of being able to articulate why this is a benefit to the business and how the practices are being used to get to that bottom line and tying them there. Companies are definitely in a catch-22. And there are things that people think they know kind of innately and haven't had to take the time to articulate in the same way that I think they're going to have to do now. And so it's that process of understanding your business, tying this discussion to your business model, and it's internal, external, who your market is, where you're facing these pressures, those types of things. There are things that I think we've seen, though, over the past 4 or 5 years, particularly from some of the attorneys general around the country, where they pushed on certain topics. And those are things that we saw in the education space as well, at the University of Michigan and some of the cases in the past. So I think that you can look at those legal decisions to understand where courts might go. And this unlawful DEI will be, I think, ultimately litigated, what that means and what the expressions are. But I think if you look at those legal cases, I think that you'll be able to see some of the places that you should be focused as a business. And so having targets, having, versus you must have this number of people attend. Where's the difference in there? Where are courts going to land? Having goals, having those types of things. Is that the same thing as, having a quota? So I think that we look to the cases that are already out there. We look to the pressure points. And I think that a point that Eric made early on in our discussion, some of this isn't actually about what's legally enforceable. Some of this is about pressure and changing behavior without having a legally enforceable situation. And so I think we'll also see where that shakes out and where people's values land on that spectrum.
Can I jump in one thing, Stavros? So I think that you frame this in terms of risk management, which is obviously a core function of the board, but it's not the only function of the board, right? Because companies are in the business of making money for their shareholders. So, the risk analysis of the type that, Melissa and I have been discussing with you is only part of only one side of the coin here, right? Boards shouldn't lose sight at the same time that they're thinking through the risks that we're describing, their core function of thinking through opportunities for the company, thinking through how to access new markets and develop new products. And like your human capital management strategy is a huge part of that. And how you are thinking about your workforce in terms of opportunity and new markets and new products is also important, not just sort of the risk management function.
So uh, I had another question that relates to regulatory priorities for agencies. So both of you were at the SEC, and you know how agencies form, you know, from the inside, how agencies form views about priorities or positions and how they move ahead with these priorities. What is your sense of how much DEI or looking into disclosures about DEI is going to be a priority for the SEC in the years to come?
I can start with that, Melissa, unless you'd like to.
Please.
I mean, as we noted at the beginning, like this is not a traditional federal securities law question. There's only one area, one rule, and this was an Obama era rule that I mentioned earlier that explicitly mentions diversity and disclosure. Um, so this is not so much, I think, something that the SEC staff has traditionally focused on.
Mhm.
That being said, I think what we've seen in the last few months is that federal agencies and the leadership is very, very much taking their cues directly from the White House and from people surrounding the White House. So I think you're going to see a divergence across many different agencies between traditional areas of focus, traditional statutory authority, and what directions might be coming straight from the White House.
I agree with Eric. The only thing I would add is I do think that this is not a core mission for the SEC. This is something that I'm not even sure the SEC can enforce with regard to unless people significantly change their disclosure. One of the things we haven't talked about is the criminal aspect of this and where DOJ is going to fit within this. And I do see the administration in some of the statements that Pam Bondi has made and others with regard to this, looking at a possibility for criminal enforcement. And that I think could come off of, for example, Section 1001, which is making a materially false statement to, an investigator. It could be the FBI, it could be the SEC, it could be any number of people. And so I can imagine also the Hill being part of the process and pulling people up to have discussions about DEI and the implications. And so I think that it's really beyond the agency or the agencies, from my point of view, more towards possible criminal cases if they're able to find that, or being pulled up to the Hill. So I would focus there.
Yeah, I mean, Stavros, I think one insight I got from working at the SEC for almost 4 years is almost every conversation like starts with like, what's our statutory authority?
Mhm.
If you are a staff member, what's our statutory authority here? Um, what is our core mission? And what's the problem that we're trying to solve with a particular policy initiative or a particular rulemaking or a particular staff action? And if you start from that approach, like the kinds of issues that we're talking about, like just don't fit within traditional like statutory authority or traditional securities disclosure analysis. So it really is about the types of issues and the types of other agencies that Melissa mentioned.
Mhm. So we're concerned essentially about. So one of the many concerns that we have is that the statements that companies might provide could become fodder for other types of enforcement procedures that are beyond the ICC. But it's just that the disclosure process is the process that's forcing them to come out with these statements in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
That's not to say that there's like zero risk of staff comments here, so I don't want to give that impression. You always have to make sure that your disclosure again has no material misstatements or omissions. If you're making statements, that you're able to back them up, and that you've done due diligence on those statements. There might be more focus on staff questions on ESG disclosures more broadly. But again, I think the way that we framed it at the top of this talk, that this is really stuff that is coming from outside the federal securities laws and risks that are coming from outside the federal securities laws, is the primary way to focus on this.
Great. So I think this brings us back to full circle, and it's almost perfect timing because we're very close at time. So I wanted to ask you both for any final closing statements, kind of distilling the conversation and telling people what they need to remember or what they need to understand as we're talking about DEI disclosures in this moment. Melissa, let me start with you.
Okay, thank you. And I really enjoyed this conversation. I think what I would say is companies are stuck in a tough position here, but there are things that they can do. And so I think that's really the message that we wanted to put out there. There are risks, but they can be managed, and there's opportunities in this moment as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can back cleanup, I guess, Stavros. So I think that this is clearly a very challenging moment for public companies, for their in-house and their external securities lawyers. But thinking through just sort of back to basic securities lawyering, I think really helps. What's required? What's optional? How is this driving the business strategy? Those kinds of basic questions, I think, will help companies navigate this, whether it's in securities disclosure, whether it's in corporate governance, and ultimately, again, being able to balance not just risk, but the core kinds of business opportunities, the core kind of business strategies that companies have always been focused on.
Great. Thank you both very much. I really enjoyed this conversation. This is a topic that we get all the time from alumni, from members of our community, from students as well. Companies have become the epicenter of these kinds of questions. And I think you helped us a lot in developing a way of thinking about them. Thank you very much, Melissa. Thank you very much, Eric, for being with us today.
Thank you, and go Bears.
Great. Thank you both. Bye-bye.
Bye.